students. Welcome to the ongoing lecture series on international business. We are discussing the theories of international trade. This is a lecture on theories of international trade part 2. I am Professor Shoma Sengupta, Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi. Now we have discussed one of the classical theory of international trade, that is the theory of absolute cost advantage. Here we will discuss the second theory, and that is comparative cost advantage theory. Beside that, we will discuss another theory of international trade, that is factor proportion or endowment theory. So, comparative cost advantage theory. This theory comes out, or it is the outcome of one of the limitation of the absolute cost advantage theory that we have discussed in the previous lecture. The limitation of that theory was, it does not explain what happens when one country has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. So, if you remember, we have discussed the absolute cost advantage theory. Each of the country was having absolute cost advantage in production of one of the commodities, and they produces that commodity and exchange or trade it with another country. But if one of the country is having absolute cost advantage in production of both the commodities, then shouldn't they go for international trade, or what will be the situation? So, this we will discuss in comparative cost advantage theory. So, David Ricardo removed this limitation. He has written a book in 1817 titled Principles of Political Economy. There he discussed the theory of comparative cost advantage. Ricardo stated that, other things being equal, a country tends to specialize in and export those commodities in the production of which it has maximum comparative cost advantage or minimum comparative disadvantage. So, the point here which is new is the comparative cost advantage. So, if you have maximum comparative cost advantage, produce that product, and if you do not have that kind of advantage, or you have a minimum comparative disadvantage, then also you produce that product, otherwise you will not produce that product, you will in fact import that product. Similarly, the country's imports will be goods, which we have discussed now, having relatively less comparative cost advantage or greater disadvantage. So, if that is the situation, better import the commodity rather than produce that commodity indigenously or domestically. So, this was the theorem of Ricardo. Through that theory, he explained trade between nations in a situation where one country is more efficient in the production of both tradable commodities. So, if one country is efficient in the production of both the products, then also international trade will happen. So, this we will discuss in this theory. The theory states that both countries would continue to gain from trade even if one is more efficient in the production of both the goods. So, this is a unique situation. So, one country is having advantage in production of both the goods, still they will go for international trade for one of the commodity, and one they will produce indigenously. So, there are certain assumptions of the comparative cost advantage theory, and these assumptions are quite similar to absolute cost advantage theory. That is, two countries and two goods. Labor is the only factor of production. For simplicity, they are considering only one resource, that is labor. There is perfect mobility of labor within a country, but not between the countries. Cost of production are measured in terms of the labor units involved. Homogeneous units of labor and goods are there. That means there is no disparity in the quality of labor or quality of goods. There is unrestricted or free trade between the countries. So, that means again no trade barriers are there. So, the assumptions of absolute cost advantage theory were repeated in comparative cost advantage theory more or less. Also no transportation cost, because we are considering only one cost, and that is the labor cost. Constant returns to scale, which was discussed earlier also, that no economies of scale is there. There is full employment equilibrium, and there is perfect competition with regard to demand for the commodities. Now, to explain the theory, there are certain additional assumptions, like India has absolute cost advantage in production of both the commodities. Say this is the situation that India is better off in terms of absolute cost advantage for production of both cotton as well as coffee. So, assuming that Brazil requires 10 units to produce 1 ton of coffee and 10 units to produce 1 ton of cotton. So, this situation was the same as we have discussed in the previous theory. But India requires only 5 units to produce 1 ton of coffee and 4 units to produce 1 ton of cotton. So, there is this difference that Brazil is having cost disadvantage in production of both the commodities, and India is having cost advantage in production of both the commodities. So, take this example. Here what is happening, that India is having a cost advantage in production of coffee as well as cotton, because it is taking only 5 units to produce coffee and 4 units to produce cotton, while Brazil requires 10 units of a resource, that is the labor hours, for production of coffee as well as for production of cotton. So, India is having advantage. Now, world output without trade. So, if no trade happens between these two countries, then what will happen, that if there is no trade between these countries, each will use half of the available resources for the production of coffee and half for the production of cotton. So, the world output without trade will be what? Take this situation where 100 units of resource is available for each of the country and 2 commodities are there. If there are no trade, then each of the country will devote half of the resources for production of one commodity and the other half for production of another commodity. So, for Brazil 50 units for coffee and 50 units for cotton, since the resource requirement is 10 units per ton for each of the commodity, the output will be 5 tons of coffee and 5 tons of cotton. So, the total will be 10 tons of the product, of the two products taken together. For India, 50-50 will be again the input, and since the units required per ton is 5 for coffee and 4 for cotton, so the output will be, when we divide 50 by 5, it is 10 tons of coffee and 12.5 tons of cotton. Total production will be 22.5 tons of the two products taken together. So, the total is 32.5 tons. Okay. Now, without trade, Brazil will produce 5 tons of coffee, 5 tons of cotton, while India will produce 10 tons of coffee and 12.5 tons of cotton. That is visible in the figure, point A for Brazil and point B for India. So, if you see this diagram, you will find A point much below and B on the dotted lines for India. Then the total world output would be 32.5 tons, that is 10 tons by Brazil and 22.5 tons by India. The combined production of coffee will be 15 tons, the combined production of cotton will be 17.5 tons. Now, if they trade, world output, what will be the situation if they trade, and why they should trade? India has absolute cost advantage in the production of both coffee and cotton and produces more of both the commodities. So, if we see this table, we find that India is having cost advantage for production of both the commodities, because it can produce coffee efficiently in comparison to Brazil, as well as cotton also more efficiently than Brazil. India's comparative advantage in production is there. It produces twice as much coffee as Brazil, that is 10 is produced by 10 is requirement of Brazil, but 5 hours is the requirement or units is requirement of India. So 10 by 5, that means twice. India can produce 2.5 times more cotton than Brazil. That is 10 divided by 4, it comes out to be 2.5 times. So more efficient in production of cotton in comparison to production of coffee, although in absolute term India is enjoying that cost advantage for production of both the commodities. So, there still the individual countries and world will benefit out of trade because of opportunity cost of production is involved. So, Ricardo has introduced this concept of opportunity cost of production which is involved, and this will be the deciding factor of which country will trade what with the other country. Now again I am showing this table, and it will register in your mind that how much is required of units are required for production of which commodity by each of the country. Now divide this, say for coffee, what is the opportunity cost for Brazil for production of coffee? If they use 10 units for production of coffee and not the 10 units for cotton, so 10 by 10 it is 1, and for cotton again 10 by 10 it is 1. But when we talk about opportunity cost of India, if they produce 5, produce by introducing 5 units for coffee and nothing for cotton, then it is 5 by 4, that is 1.25 is the opportunity cost. And if it devotes the whole of resources for cotton and not for coffee, that is 4 by 5, it is 0.8. So, we can see from this table that Brazil has the opportunity cost advantage in production of coffee, and India is having opportunity cost advantage in production of cotton because that is the lowest 0.8. Now moving further, what we say that Brazil has a lower opportunity cost in producing coffee than India. India has a lower opportunity cost in producing cotton than Brazil. Hence India has comparative advantage in production of cotton and Brazil in coffee. Now if this is the situation, the whole of 100 units will be devoted by Brazil for the production of coffee, and hence the units required is 10 per ton. So, they can produce 10 tons of coffee and no cotton. So, the total output is 10 tons. For India, it is whole of the amount is used for cotton. So, they can produce 25 tons of cotton because 100 divided by 4 units required per ton is comes out to be 25. Now, the world output will be 25 tons of cotton and 10 tons of coffee. That makes 35 tons of output for the whole world. Now, you can see that previously without trade it was 32.5 and now it is 35 tons. So, with trade it has increased, the world output has increased. So, this diagram, the situation is that the point C, that is Brazil will produce the whole of the output for coffee, and India's position is point F where they are producing the whole of cotton. If two countries trade with each other, Brazil will export coffee and import cotton, India will export cotton and import coffee. If two countries trade with each other, India will produce 25 units of cotton and Brazil produces 10 units of coffee with a total output of 35 units. Total global production as a result of trade would be 35 tons of output, a gain of 2.5 tons as a result of trade. Hence, countries engage in open trade benefit from lower cost of production and also from opportunity cost involved. Now, the merits of comparative cost advantage theory. First advantage is increased efficiency in production and consumption. Countries can increase their overall efficiency by specializing and trading, leading to higher global production and consumption. Access to wider variety of goods. Trade allows countries to access goods and services they may not be able to produce themselves, increasing the variety of goods available to consumers. Economic growth. Comparative advantage can lead to economic growth by allowing countries to produce and export more goods, creating jobs and increasing income. Now, there are certain limitations which are similar to what we have studied in absolute cost advantage theory. The unrealistic assumption is the main limitation. Only two countries in the world, only two commodities, no transportation cost. Two commodities can be exchanged in 1:1 ratio. Prices of resources are the same in the two countries. Resources cannot move freely. All these are unrealistic assumption, and these are the limitations of comparative cost advantage theory. Also, it does not account for the complexities like trade barriers, transportation cost, and other factors that can affect trade patterns. It does not address the potential negative impact of trade on specific industries or workers in a country. So, these are the limitations. We move on to another theory, and that is factor proportion or endowment theory. Now, this theory is also called Heckscher-Ohlin or HO theorem. The theory was propounded by Elie Heckscher in 2019 and modified by Bertil Ohlin in 1933. So, the theory explains international trade in terms of national factor endowments and the comparative advantage of nations. Now, this theory is a very general theory, and it is the basis of international trade or export and import that we have explained in probably in the first lecture of this series, that Mother Earth has not bestowed all the areas with or all the countries with equal amount of resources. So, one country may be having a comparative advantage or endowment to produce a particular product in certain manner. So, that will become their resource, and in that way they will utilize it for the production of a particular commodity that will give advantage to that country to export that product, produce that product and export that product to other country. So, comparative advantage results from differences in factor endowments. Now, there are certain assumptions of the factor proportion or endowment theory. The first assumption is that different countries are endowed with different amount of land, labor and capital. A country having abundant capital but less labor has a comparative advantage of producing that commodity which requires more of capital than labor. Another country with less capital and more labor will use more labor intensive production. Technology is constant across the world. This is another assumption. Demand for factors of production is identical across the world, and the cost of production is determined by its supply. So, whether the technology used will be labor intensive or capital intensive, that will depend upon the resources available or the country's endowments. For example, China and India have labor intensive industries like textiles, because initially we had lesser of capital but more of labor. So, the industries which require more of labor, whether it is textile or labor, they flourished in countries like China and India. Also, we will discuss the outcomes of factor proportion and endowment theory. So, what the theory suggests? The comparative advantage of nations is a result of differences in its basic economic structure. So, in certain country they are more labor intensive because labor is available in abundance in their economic structure, while in another country there may be abundance of capital. So, they will but shortage of labor. So, they will have capital intensive production units. A country's efficiency in production depends on its cost of production, which depends on the availability of its factors of production. So, this is the basis of the factor proportion or endowment theory. A country has a lower cost of production through the use of its abundant factors as compared to its scarce factors of production. This implies that if an economy has more labor in comparison to land and capital, its production cost would be lower if it uses labor intensive technology. So, as I said that this is the general understanding of whenever we talk about international business or we talk about business per se, that in which country what technology will be used, that is determined by what kind of factor endowment they have. Now, there are certain examples of factor, proportion or endowment theory that China and India export labor intensive products like textile and leather. Now, as we have discussed, in these two types of industry, more of labor is required. And after independence, like India has capital shortage, so capital equipments or machinery were lesser in number, and because of that labor intensive technology was used in many industry. On the other hand, developed countries which have more of capital like USA and Germany, they export capital intensive products like machinery and engineering items, because they can produce that type of product, they can use that type of technology where more of capital is required, but they have lesser hands or the labor is scarce in such countries. So, they use more of capital intensive products or manufacturing facilities. Now, what are the implications of factor, proportion or endowment theory? The implications are like free trade is beneficial and determines the pattern because of the differences in factor endowment, and this will determine the pattern of international trade. As what will happen that from the developed nations, capital intensive products will move or they will export it to the countries where there are they have labor intensive products. So, they can't produce capital intensive products. So, that will be the pattern of trade, and those countries will export labor intensive product to these rich countries. Trade as well as trade gains should be the greatest between countries with the greatest differences in economic structure. So, if a developed country with capital intensive goods trade with a country which is developing or underdeveloped with which is producing labor intensive goods or technology, then that will be most beneficial. Countries should export goods that make intensive use of their relatively abundant factors. Trade would result in countries specializing, producing and exporting goods that are based on their economic structure and distinctly different from their imports. Trade policy should take the form of trade restrictions rather than trade stimulation. So, that will determine the direction of trade. Now, to summarize this lecture, what we can say, we have discussed two theories. One was part of the classical theory, and that is the comparative cost advantage theory, which was given by David Ricardo. He explained that a country tends to specialize in and export those commodities in the production of which it has maximum comparative cost advantage. The theory states that both countries would continue to gain from trade even if one is more efficient in the production of both the goods. So, we have seen that India was having a comparative cost advantage in production of both coffee and cotton, but they will concentrate in the production of cotton where the opportunity cost is the lowest. So, the theory introduces the concept of opportunity cost of production. The country that has comparative advantage in production of a product with lower opportunity cost should produce that product. So, that was the outcome of this theory. The theory was criticized for its unrealistic assumption. So, another theory that we have discussed in this lecture was the factor, proportion or endowment theory, and it is called Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. The theory states that different countries are endowed with different amount of land, labor and capital. Trade gain should be greatest between countries with the greatest differences in economic structure. Countries should export goods that make intensive use of their relatively abundant factors. So, these are certain references. One is C.B. Gupta, and then Sumati Verma's book, then Hill and Hult. These are the books on international business which were referred to for this lecture. Thank you, students.